I will did that without even moving my lips. Excellent. Okay, welcome everybody to this special evening, which is dedicated to a number of people. Unfortunately, tonight and this week, we seem to have a Yorkshire fest amongst everybody here. The original idea was that we would do this shiur in memory of Neville and Deborah's mum, Alma Gatoff, Alea Shalom, and my mum, Shirley Lieberman, because they're Yorkshites. It's Alma's Yorkshire tonight. It's my mum's Yorkshire and my sister's mum's Yorkshire, funnily enough, on Shabbat. And we dedicate it to them. Neville, I think, is going to say just a couple of words about his mum. And then I'll say a couple of words about my mum, but I'd also like to take the opportunity of wishing both Michael and Anita Leaf Yorkshire, because they both have Yorkshire this week. I think Michael's is yours tonight as well. Yes, Michael's father and Anita's mother, and we wish them Chaim Arukim as well. So Neville, if you would like to unmute yourself and say a couple of words about your lovely mum, of course, who I remember very fondly as one of my customers back in the day when I used to be a doctor. So Neville, please.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to Johnny for dedicating this year in joint memory of our respective mothers who died a few days apart, as we commemorate their first Yorkshire this year. My mum had a long life, dying at the ripe old age of 91. She was the daughter of Newman and Ethel Goldman, who lived most of their lives in Sunderland, a small community situated on the northeast coast of England. She grew up in an era where it was not popular to educate women, and so her main education was gained through her parents. She worked with our father in a clothing and outfitting business for men and women. Her famous smile and agreeable personality endeared her to her customers, and even though she had no training in business, she maintained and expanded the activities of the business. Living in a small provincial town was a challenge for Jewish people, being constantly aware that we, like it or not, were ambassadors of our religion. Many of the people we as a family mixed with had never met a Jew before, and they may never meet another one again. Therefore, whatever impression we made would be perceived as how Jews behave in general. This was a responsibility that was instilled into us as we were growing up and was taken very seriously. This is called creating a Kiddush Hashem. Although it came to her naturally, and was just simply the right thing to do. Our mother died on Asara B'Teves, the date which commemorates the siege of the Bet Mikdash in Yerushalayim. For the temple to be rebuilt in our time, we must foster a spirit of brotherly love and kindness to all. These are the midot which embodied our mother, and that she passed on to us, to me and our siblings and our children. Her life revolved around her family, to whom she was totally devoted, leaving a legacy of 8 grandchildren and 18 great-grandchildren, all of whom she was justifiably proud. We miss her so much, and may her memory be for a blessing. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Neville. I can endorse all of those things from my knowledge of your mum. She was a lovely lady. I don't want to overslog you, but if you think that your mum was brought up and born in a provincial town, then I'm afraid we have nothing on that, because our mum was born in Shrewsbury, which I don't think it's ever seen a Jew until they arrived. In fact, I don't even know how they even got there, but it was Jewless until they came. And of course, many of you will be familiar with my mum's trademark expression, "not bad for a girl from Shrewsbury," when she referred to her 2 grandchildren who were rabbis. I heard a very beautiful expression today, actually, from somebody, actually it was from Shoshana Baker, who I spoke about a second ago. Shoshana told me that Rav Benny Lau has an expression that he says to people who have yortzites or who have lost somebody. He doesn't like the idea of hamakom yenachem, God should comfort you. He says because it's very difficult to comfort. And of course, the concept of wishing long life is a very English concept. The Israelis don't do that. They don't say Chaim Arukin or long life. It's a very English thing, that. So what he says to people, and it's a beautiful expression, he says Ga'aguim Matukim, which means that you should have sweet memories. And that's what we should have, all of us who have yortzites and all of us who have lost loved ones. I wish us all together that we should have Ga'aguim Matukim. We should have sweet memories of our loved ones when they've passed on. My mum was like Alma was, and I'm sure like Anita's mum was, a real Jewish mother. And what do I mean by that? I mean that she worried about her children. And no doubt over the years, her children, i.e. myself and my sister, gave her reason to cry for her children. Not deliberately, but I've no doubt that she shed a tear or two over us over the years. And of course, that brings us to the topic that I've chosen for tonight's talk, which is Mama Rachel, our mother Rachel, who famously weeps for her children. Let me just share this with you to start with.
With the rising sun on her wedding day, she raised her eyes to the heavens, and she thanked Hashem for the man of truth, with whom she would build a nation. But with nightfall came destiny betrayed, the veil concealing another. Yet a sister's shame, not her shattered dreams, took hold of her heart and her senses. Mama Rachel, cry for us again. Won't you shed a tear for your dear children? If you raise your sweet voice now, as then the day will come. Mama Rachel, cry for us again. Won't you shed a tear for your dear children? B'zichutech v'shavu banim ligulon. In a roadside grave, she was laid to rest in solitude forever. her daughters and sons bound for exile. When her plaintive cry gained divine consent, a challenge to her maker, can the mercy of mere flesh and blood run deeper than yours, our Creator? Mama Rachel, cry for us again. Won't you shed a tear for your dear children? If you raise your sweet voice, now is then the day will come.
Okay, so Mama Rachel, Cry. That beautiful song by Yaakov Shweki is only one of many, many different songs which have been written and sung about Rachel Imenu, Rachel, our mother, crying for her children. The songs are all based on a very famous pasuk in the book of Jeremiah. And I'm going to share the screen again with you now. I hope you can see that. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Yeah, excellent. So this pasuk is from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, and it should be familiar to you because it is part of the Haftarah for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, which you will all have heard. And the context is that in the previous chapters, Yirmiyahu, of course, Jeremiah, who is known as the prophet of doom, had in his previous chapters had told of all the terrible things that were going to happen to the Bnei Israel at the destruction of the temple and the exile from Jerusalem. But then he comes and says, but at the end of the day, God will return to us and we will return to him. And this is what he says here. He says, Ko'ama Hashem, Kol B'Ramah Nishma. A voice is heard B'Ramah. And it's translated here as on high, which is a reasonable translation because the word Ramah means high or height. Ramat Poleg, Ramat Hagolan, the Golan Heights. But it also has another meaning, and we will come back to that later on. So I want you to remember that expression, Kol B'Ramah Nishma, a voice in Ramah, upon high is heard. And that voice is Rachel Mevaka al Baneha, Rachel, crying for her children, Ki Einena, because they're not there. The children are not there. And the verse goes on. We'll come to the grey box in a minute, which is Rashi. But the verse goes on. Jeremiah goes on to say, so says Hashem, stop crying, don't cry. Refrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears. For there is reward for your work, says Hashem. And they shall come back from the land of the enemy, talking about Rachel's children because she's crying for her children. And God says, don't cry anymore. I've heard your tears and your tears will be rewarded. The children will come back from exile. And then he says, V'yesh tikvah la'achritech. There is hope for the end of days, for your future, says Hashem. And then the famous expression that it ends with, V'shavu vanim ligvulam. And the children shall return to their borders. And this is a tremendous comfort for the Bnei Israel at the time of Jeremiah, who was almost unending dirge. Jeremiah was miserable from the start to the finish almost, because he lived at such terrible times of the destruction. But this was balm for their ears and eyes, that Jeremiah says that at the end of days, Rachel will weep for her children, and God will hear that weeping, and her children will return to their borders. In other words, they'll come back from exile. So we have this imagery of Rachel weeping for her children. And now I just want to go back to the grey box here, which is Rashi on this pasuk. Rashi brings a midrash which says that there was a time when Manasseh did a terrible thing. The tribe of Manasseh, a person called Manasseh, did a terrible thing. He put an idol in the temple, and this was unbelievably bad thing to do. You can't get any worse than putting an idol in the temple. And as it were, the Midrash says that the Avot and the Imahot, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, all came in to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, to plead for mercy against the decree that was likely to happen against the Bnei Israel because they'd done such a terrible thing. And none of them were able to, as it were, assuage the anger of God until Rachel came. And Rachel said the following thing. This is a midrash. Rachel said, hang on a minute, God. I also had a rival in my home. My husband, Jacob, worked for 7 years for me. And then we did a switch at the time of the wedding. And my father was a tricky sort of fellow, and Jacob thought there might be some monkey business going on. So we devised signs so that he would know it was me. And in order to prevent my sister, Leah, from being shamed, I gave her the signs, and I gave up, as it were, my husband in order not to shame my wife, my sister. I had mercy on my sister. So surely God, says Rachel, my mercy is not as great as yours. Surely your mercy is greater than that of me, mere flesh and blood. And God said to her, you have defended them well. There is reward for your deed and for your righteousness, that you gave over your password to your sister. So in other words, this Rashi brings this midrash, which explains that Rachel was the one who was able to, as it were, break through to God because she herself had been merciful to her sister. And the reward that she gets is that her children will return to their border. And so this imagery of Rachel weeping for her children, described by Jeremiah, has become the archetypal weeping of a Jewish mother for her children. And of course, generations upon generations of people have gone to the tomb of Rachel to pour out their heart to Mama Rachel, to ask her to intervene with God on their behalf, in order to get the mercy of God for whatever particular sorrows they particularly have. The tomb of Rachel, Kever Rachel, over the generations, thousands of years, has been an address where people in deep sorrow have come to in order to pour out their heart and to ask Rachel, Rachel Imenu, Mama Rachel, to cry for them. So that's where the song comes from. That's where the imagery of Rachel crying for her children comes from. It comes from the prophet Jeremiah. And we will return to this pasuk towards the end of the shiur. But for now, I just want to show you some pictures. That's a picture taken in, it is a photograph, it's a very early photograph taken, I think, in the early years of the 20th century of Kever Rachel. It's very familiar to you. You've seen it many, many times in many, many pictures. That is what it looks like today. You can see the basic structure, but sadly, it's had to be enclosed in hugely thick concrete walls because it is in an area which is an area of conflict in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the occupied West Bank. And that's what it looks like today. So we're all familiar with that picture. And those of us who've been there will know what it looks like today. Many of us will have seen that picture there. But I want to ask the question, is this really where Rachel is buried? Is this place where we all go and where thousands, tens of thousands over the generations of Jews have flocked to pour out their heart? Is this really where Rachel is buried? And I want to present to you 3 different possibilities for the burial place of Rachel, all of them based on scriptural analysis. And then at the end, we will perhaps try and square up all 3 possibilities and come to some kind of, if not conclusion, at least some kind of suggestion as to where Rachel is really buried. So let's go straight into possibility number 1. And this is from Sefer Bereshit. This is the story of Rachel's death. We all know the story, don't we? Vayisumi Bet El. They were traveling. Jacob and his family had previously encountered Esav, his brother, and he's successfully gone through that meeting of Esav, and he was on his way back from the house of Lavan to Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan, as it was called at that time. And Vayisumi Beit El, and they journeyed from Beit El. Vayehi od kivrat haaretz lavo Ephrata. They were still some distance away from a place called Ephrat. V'teled Rachel vatkash belidata. And Rachel started to go into labor, started to give birth. She was pregnant, of course, with Binyamin, and her labor was difficult. Vayehi v'kishta belidata. And she had such difficulty giving birth. And the midwife said to her, Al tiri, do not be afraid. Ki gam zelach ben. You're also gonna, this is going to be another son. And as her soul departed, because she died in childbirth, Vatikra shemo ben Oni. She called him Ben Oni, the son of my affliction. Va'aviv karalo Binyamin. And his father called him Binyamin. That's for another day why she called him Ben Oni and he called him Binyamin. That's for another day, not for now. Vatamod Rachel, and Rachel died. Vatikaver bederech Ephrata hi Beit Lachem. And she was buried on the road, but bederech, on the way, Ephrata, on the way to Ephrat. And just to let us know which Ephrat and where this Ephrat is, he Beit Lachem, that is Bethlehem, Beit Lechem. Ephrat and Beit Lechem are the same place, the Torah is telling us. So Rachel was buried on the way to Beit Lechem. Now we know that they were coming from Beit El. Well, I'm going to show you a map in a minute, but we know they were coming from Beit El, which was to the north, and they hadn't yet reached Beit Lechem, and therefore where she died and where she was buried must have been to the north of Beit Lechem, because they haven't yet reached it and they're coming from the north. Vayatzev Yaakov matzeva al kvurata. And Jacob erected a matzeva. That's perhaps where we get our expression from when we put up a matzeva at the grave of our loved ones. Yaakov erected a monument on her burial place. He matzevet kvurat Rachel ad hayom. That is the burial place, the tombstone of Rachel ad hayom, until today. An interesting expression, until today. Which day? We'll come back to that too. So, based on this text that we've just said, which is the fundamental text of where Rachel was buried, it must be slightly to the north of Bethlehem. And then we've got further proof from that. Later on, in the same story, we're told that Yisrael, that's Jacob, journeyed and he spread his tent beyond a place called Migdal Eder, which means the tower of the flock. Now, when we read this in Bereshit, we don't take too much notice of it because, so what? It's a place. But the prophet Micha picks up on this expression, and it tells us there, and the Mishnah in Shkalim explains that Migdal Eder was a place near Bethlehem, where they kept this special area where they kept the flocks of sheep and goats and what have you, that were taken on a daily basis for the korbanot, the sacrifices in the Bet Mikdash. The Bet Mikdash, of course, was in Jerusalem. Bethlehem is not far from there. Migdal Eder was near Bethlehem, and it was, if you like, a holding area for the flocks. And so this shows us, this is a further support for the idea that Jacob was on his way to Bethlehem when Rachel died, and that is where she was buried. So there's a map of the area that's taken off Google Maps today. The red blob that you can see is the Kever Rachel that we are all familiar with. You can see it is just to the north of Bethlehem. It is south of, but not so far away from Jerusalem. And if you want to get it into perspective, I'll show you another map in a little while. But if we were looking at where Bet El would be in this map, it will be off the map. It will be around about here where my pointer is messing around. It's probably just above the A of Tchelet there, would be Bet El. Yaakov was coming south towards Bethlehem. He got as far as there, and that is where Rachel died. That would be possibility number one, based on the psukim in Bereshit and supported by Micha and the Mishnah in Shkalim. So we've got a fairly strong proof there that the traditional site, which is what I will call our Kever Rachel of today, I'm going to refer that to that as the traditional site. We have good proof so far. So if I was to stop the shiur now, you would all go away and say, well, I'm happy because there is proof from the psukim that where I've been to Kever Rachel is supported by the Torah, it's supported by Tanakh, and it's supported by the Mishnah. Thank you very much and good night. But there is another possibility, possibility number two. Okay, now, possibility number two is based on a pasuk in Sefer Shmuel Aleph. And it is this pasuk, actually, which inspired this shiur. For those of you who don't know, many of you do because you join it, there is a Tanakh shiur which we have every Sunday morning. And we are currently learning Sefer Shmuel Aleph. And we're currently learning chapter 10. And a couple of weeks ago, we read this verse. And this, let me put this into context for those of you who are not familiar with it. Shmuel, who was the prophet at the time, has just been told by God that Shaul, Saul, is going to be the first king of Israel. And it is Shmuel's job to anoint Shaul as the king, to do the coronation of Shaul, and then to guide him, as it were, through his kingship. And right at the beginning of that encounter, Shaul meets Shmuel, and Shmuel tells him, you're going to be the king of Israel, and he actually anoints him in verse 1 I've quoted you here, verse 2. But in verse 1, Shmuel, the prophet, anoints Shaul as king in private, and then he says to him a prophecy. And he says to him like this: Belechtecha hayom me'imadi, when you leave me today, umatzata shnei anashim im kfurat Rachel, you will encounter, umatzata, you will find two men, im kfurat Rachel. Im means with, im with an ayin means with. So it means here, close by Rachel's tomb, kfurat Rachel, the burial place of Rachel. And just in case Shaul doesn't know where that is, Shmuel says to him, it is Bigvul Binyamin Betzeltzach. It's in a place called Tzeltzach, which is at the border of Benjamin, the border of the tribal territory of Benjamin. Now, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. So you would expect her burial place to be in the territory of Benjamin. Or put a different way, when the territories were being handed out, you would expect, wouldn't you, that Moshe or Yehoshua or whoever it was at the time was handing out the parcels of land. You would expect the burial place of Rachel to be in the border, within the territory of Binyamin. It makes sense, doesn't it? So Shmuel says to Shaul, go and find these two men, or you will find these two men, and they will be at Rachel's tomb in the border, at the border of Benjamin. In other words, within the border of Benjamin, within Benjaminite territory. The rest of the pasuk is not relevant. What the prophecy was, in order to understand that, you have to go back a few chapters. It doesn't matter. The first part of the pasuk is what we're interested in. Shmuel says to Shaul that the tombstone, the tomb place, the burial place of Rachel is in the border of Benjamin. Now, where is Beit Lechem? In whose territory is Beit Lechem? We know that, don't we? Because we are told many times in Tanakh that there came a man from Beit Lechem, Yehuda. Beit Lechem, Bethlehem, is in the territory of Yehuda, not in the territory of Binyamin. I'm going to show you a map in a moment. Who came from Beit Lechem, Yehuda? David HaMelech came from Beit Lechem, Yehuda. We know that Beit Lechem lies in the territory of Yehuda. Now, I apologize for the blurriness of that map, but I had to enlarge it to show you various different things. The orange blob here that you can see is the territory of Binyamin. The green section here, the sort of snotty green section over this at the bottom here, is the territory of Yehuda. Okay, and you can see very clearly the border of Binyamin runs right close to Jerusalem, and it is significantly, relatively speaking, north of Bethlehem, of Beit Lechem. You can see that Beit Lechem is very clearly in the territory of Yehuda there. Now, if we just go back up to our map here, look how close Rachel's tomb is to Beit Lechem. Superimpose that on here, and it is clear that the traditional site for Rachel's tomb is not within the border of Binyamin. It is in the territory of Yehuda, because it is close to Beit Lechem. Let's go back to our source of Bereshit, source number 2. They journeyed from Bet El. There was still some distance to go to Ephrat, which is Bethlehem. We're not told how far, and I will come back to that a little bit later as to how far it was. But on the basis of what we know today, it wasn't far, and that means that the traditional site does not fit with the verse that we just read in Shmuel Aleph. When you go from me today, you'll find 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the border of Benjamin. So possibility number 2 is that Rachel's tomb is further north from possibility 1. Possibility 1 is there where my pointer is, just outside Bethlehem. Number 2 is that it is further north, just within the territory of Binyamin. Now, where was Shmuel when he told Shaul to go down to Rachel's tomb? Well, the answer is he was at headquarters. And those of you who come to the Shmuel Aleph Shir will know that Shmuel's headquarters were over here in this place called Ramah. Where have you heard that name before? Kol Beramah Nishma. Let's go right back to source number 1, right at the top. Kol Beramah Nishma. Jeremiah says, a voice is heard on high. But Ramah is not just on high, is it? Ramah is the name of a place. The voice is heard in a place called Ramah. Okay, a place called Ramah. So that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because if we go back to our map here, we've got possibility number 1 from Bereshit, that it's just outside Bethlehem. We've got possibility number 2, that it is further north, but still south of Jerusalem, and it is just inside the border of Binyamin. And then we come to possibility number 3. I didn't need to go to the top of the page, and I forgot that I repeated source number 1 in source number 4. There it is. Ko'ama Hashem, Kol Beramah Nishma. Rachel Mevaka al Baneha. Rachel is weeping for her children in Ramah. Now, why did Yirmiyahu mention Ramah in connection with the weeping of Rachel? Now, in the time of Yirmiyahu, when the prisoners of the southern kingdom were being captured, they were put in a holding place before they were exiled, and that holding place was in Ramah. And there was a time when Yirmiyahu himself was a prisoner in Ramah, only he was let go. He was allowed to leave. In Jeremiah's time, Ramah was the place where the prisoners of Judah and Benjamin were gathered before they were carried away to Babylon. It is in chapter 40 of Yirmiyahu, we're told the word that came to Yirmiyahu from the Lord after Nebuzaradan, the chief executioner, had sent him away from Ramah when he took him, and he was bound in fetters among the entire exile of Jerusalem and Judah who were exiled to Babylon. So this verse tells us that the captives from Jerusalem, let's go back to this map, from Jerusalem were taken north to Ramah. They were kept there as prisoner before they were sent off to Babylon. Now, where is Babylon? I think I might have got a map of Babylon somewhere down here. No, I haven't. That's a different one. No, I didn't put the map of Babylon in the end. Okay, let's go back over here. Now, from Ramah, they went to Babylon. So where is Babylon on this map? It's over here somewhere. Northeast. It's in Iraq, of course. Babylon is Mesopotamia, today's Iraq. So the journey from Jerusalem was a journey north. Okay, Jerusalem is destroyed. The exile goes north to Ramah as a stopping point, and then it goes off northeast to Babel, to Babylon, or to Mesopotamia, or into today's Iraq. So, if we say that Rachel mevaka al banim, the weeping of Rachel for her children, is over here in our verse. Where's it gone? Over here, kol berama nishma, and we don't say a voice is heard on high, meaning in heaven, but we say, as do some of the Mefarshim, that kol berama nishma, the voice which is heard is the weeping of Rachel, and it's heard in the place called Ramah. And why was she weeping? Because she saw the children of hers being marched off to exile in the place of Ramah there. So in that case, that places the tomb of Rachel in a third possibility up here in Ramah. Kol b'Ramah nishma. Rachel mevaka al banim. Rachel is crying for her children from Ramah. And that would make sense of the pasuk in Yirmiyahu. The pasuk in Yirmiyahu says that she will get a reward, doesn't it? It says she'll get a reward. There is reward for your work. And what is the reward? Says Hashem, they shall come back from the land of their enemy. And that's why the Mefarshim say this must have been Rachel weeping for her children as they went out from their land into the land of the enemy. In other words, into exile. She weeps. God hears and accepts her weeping and says, it's okay, Rachel. Your weeping has worked. They will return back from the land of the enemy. And then the famous verse, there is hope for your future, and the children will return to their own border. Now, I want to ask you this question. They will return to their own border. Now, who were the children of Rachel? The children of Rachel were Yosef and Binyamin. Yosef, of course, gets split up into two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. So the children of Rachel, in terms of the tribes, are Ephraim, Manasseh, and Binyamin. Okay? Now, this is another famous map of ours, of our Shior, Johnny Halpin's favorite map. And this tells you very clearly the territories of the tribes. Here you see Binyamin. Here you see Yehuda. That mirrors what we saw earlier on in the slightly blurred one. Ephraim and Manasseh are further north. Ephraim, Manasseh split into two, of course. Western Manasseh and Eastern Manasseh, west of the Jordan and east of the Jordan. So the children of Rachel, for whom she's crying the most, because these are her, as it were, full children, her real children, her biological children, Binyamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh, are all to the north of Jerusalem. So if she is crying as they went out into exile, then that means, and if they passed her tombstone and they heard her crying for them, as the Midrash and the Mefarshim say, that the Bnei Israel, as they trudged out from Jerusalem up to Iraq over here, they passed by the tomb of Rachel, they heard her crying, and they were comforted by the fact that Rachel was crying for them. And that inspired Shweki and all the others to sing, Mama Rachel, cry for us again. If that's the case, it makes sense. They must have been going north, and therefore Rachel's tomb must be north of Jerusalem. and that's possibility number 3. Possibility number 1, where it's close to Bethlehem, which is probably just about where my pointer is there, doesn't fit. And possibility number 2, which is right on the southern border of Binyamin, south of Jerusalem, also doesn't fit, because they're not going to go from Jerusalem to Ramah, which you've seen on this map is north. They're not going to go south so that they can go past Rachel's tomb, then do a U-turn and go up to Ramah. They're just not going to do that. You don't go south to go north. Remember, they're on foot here. So they're going to be schlepped up north. So the third possibility is that Rachel's tomb is at Ramah, and that is north of Jerusalem, the same latitude as Jericho, which is over there, much north of Jerusalem, nowhere near the first traditional site and nowhere near possibility number 2. And all of those 3 possibilities have very positive and serious support from Psukim. Right? Just to recap, we have possibility number 1, the traditional site, based on the account in Bereshit of Rachel's death. Possibility number 2, based on the pasuk in Shmuel Aleph, where he says explicitly that the tomb of Rachel is at the border of Binyamin, not in the territory of Judah. And possibility number 3, brought about by the verse in Jeremiah and all the explanations that the people passed by the tomb of Rachel on their way to exile, that makes the tomb of Rachel further north in the area of Ramah. So there we have 3 different possibilities. Okay, now there's just a map that I got out of Google Maps. Rachel's tomb, the traditional site is there. Where it says Levant there, that actually is Ramah. That is biblical Ramah. So here's Jerusalem, and here's the temple.
Johnny, in English, Levant means the east.
Yes,
Has that got any significance?
Well, we know that when we refer to the Levant or Levant in your French accent, we're referring to the east, the north and east, Syria, Lebanon. That's what we call the Levant. But here, this just happens to be what the area where Ramah is, where biblical Ramah is today, is an area called Levant there. So what I wanted to show you on this map was to emphasize the unlikelihood that if they cried by Rachel's tomb on their way north to exile, they wouldn't have gone south. Here's Jerusalem. It's a long way from Rachel's tomb to Ramah. It's 46 minutes by car. It's 23 kilometers on Route 50. Now, there's no way they're going to take them by foot so that they can go to Rachel's tomb. Remember, they're prisoners. So why would they take them to Rachel's tomb and then take them to Ramah? The only way they're going to be passing by Rachel's tomb is if Rachel's tomb is in the area or somewhere on the journey from northern Jerusalem to Ramah. That was what I put. That was the reason I put this map on for. Okay, so there's our summary. The traditional site supported by Bereshit and by tradition. And you can see that I have put tradition in capital letters there on the screen, and that is deliberate. I didn't just hit the caps lock by mistake, although I do that quite often. Here I put tradition in capitals because tradition is very, very important in Judaism, is it not? There is a concept that, in fact, minhag, tradition, is in some ways more important than halakha. There are times when minhag overrides halakha. Again, not for now, perhaps for another day, but tradition is very important. So summary is that the traditional site, that's why it's called the traditional site, has a support in the Torah itself, Bereshit, and our tradition. Position number 2, which is north of the traditional site, but still south of Jerusalem, is supported by Sefer Shmuel Aleph. Shmuel Aleph is not the Torah, it is Tanakh, and it was written by Shmuel Hanavi with a degree of prophecy, Ruach HaKodesh, whatever you want to call it, but it was written by Shmuel. Bereshit, of course, is in the 5 books of Moses, and as Orthodox Jews, we believe that that is min hashamayim, from the heavens. It is divine in origin. So if you're looking at a league table, Bereshit is Premier League. Shmuel Aleph is Tanakh, that's Championship. And then the third possibility, further north around Ramah, north of Jerusalem, is really only supported by a midrashic interpretation of Jeremiah, because you could translate the pasuk in Jeremiah over here, Kol Beramah Nishma. You could translate it exactly as it is translated here. This is taken, by the way, from the Chabad Tanakh website, a very, very useful resource for those of you who want to have a nicely presented, translated Tanakh. A voice is heard on high. So it's only a midrashic interpretation of the word Beramah, which gives us position number 3. So if we were to stop here, we would say, I think, that the most likely scenario, or at least the scenario which has the most support for us, is the traditional site, Keva Rachel as we know it, because the support there is Premier League, Bereshit, and thousands of years of tradition. The second possibility, Shmuel Aleph, is less conclusive. And the third one is I say only, and I don't mean to diminish the importance of Midrash, nor do I diminish the importance of the idea that for generations people have understood that Rachel cries for her children. It nevertheless has less support than the other 2. Now, what we would love to do is actually to be able to say that these 3 things are not mutually exclusive. As it stands at the moment, they can't all be right. It can't be in 3 different places. Rachel cannot be buried in 3 different places. She can only be buried in one place. She might have been buried in 3 different places at different times in history, I grant you, but there's no evidence in anything that we've ever seen or read in any of the Midrashim, Mefarshim, to say that Rachel was exhumed and reinterred elsewhere. We don't see that. So you could argue that they're all right because at some point in history they were all in those places, but there's no evidence for that at all. So I would like to suggest to you, with the help of some reading around and a little bit of imagination, I suspect that out of the 59 participants that there are here, 58 if you don't count me, there'll be a significant number of you that will listen to the next bit and say, nah, I'm not having that, don't buy it. And that's fine, I don't mind that. This is my interpretation, and therefore you're entitled to take it or leave it. I would like to suggest the following. We don't really know where Rachel is buried for sure, but we can square all 3 possibilities with the following theory. So the traditional site is the closest that we have, and it's based on Bereshit. We don't even know if it's exactly there. All we know is that it was a short distance from Bethlehem. We don't know if it was exactly at that point, but it was there or thereabouts. The fact that Shmuel says that the tomb of Rachel is at the border of Binyamin's territory may not indicate that the tomb is in a different place, but the border is in a different place. How many times in the early 20th century did the borders of Europe, for example, change? I remember discussing with my aunt, she should have a refuah shalema, that when she spoke to her parents who were in Romania, who came from a small place in Romania on the Moldovan border, that one week they were in Romania, the next week they were in Moldova, the next week they were in Russia. The borders moved all over the place. What's to say that the border of Binyamin was a fixed thing? We do know, don't we, from Tanakh, we know that Binyamin had a civil war with the rest of the tribes. After the story of the Pilegesh Begivah, the concubine in Givah, we had the story of the civil war between the other tribes of Israel and Binyamin. Now, we know, don't we, even today, that when you have a war, borders move. That's nothing new. So what if that was the original border of Binyamin that I've got you on the screen at the moment? And there is Bethlehem, there is Rachel's tomb outside of Bethlehem and in the territory of Yehuda. Okay, but what if the territory of Binyamin had moved and it was a movable thing at some point or other? And that means at the time of Shmuel, for example, let's say that the border of Binyamin was on the dotted line and not the completed line. That would place the same traditional site that we have just inside the border of Binyamin. If I show you slightly differently in the blurry map, let's say the border is as it is at the moment, the orange into the green. What if that border extended a wee bit more? Because borders change. There were fences there with electronic fences and barbed wire and all that stuff. Maybe the border changed, and actually there is a theory put forward by a chap who's a Christian missionary called Porter, who I didn't want to quote, but these are Porter's maps, that this exactly is what happened. So instead of saying that the tomb was in a different place, we can square up possibility number one and possibility number two by saying that the border of Binyamin was something which was movable. It didn't stay fixed. And at the time of Shmuel, when he said to Shaul, go to Rachel's tomb, it's at the border of Binyamin, perhaps exactly because the border was a movable feast, but exactly that was the reason that he had to say, go to Rachel's tomb, which is at the border of Binyamin. So that, I think, rather neatly puts together possibility one and possibility two. We've got a real problem, though, haven't we, with possibility three, because that's miles away up in Ramah to the north. And so what we have to do with possibility number three is that we have to go to the Ramban, Nachmanides. Now, Nachmanides, Ramban originally said that he thought that the Kivrat, the pasuk where it says right at the beginning in Bereshit, where it says that Rachel was buried, where they were on the way, and they were od kivrat haaretz lavo Ephrata. They hadn't yet there was still some distance away from Ephrat, from Bethlehem. The Ramban originally thought that was rather a long way, a day's distance, a day or two's traveling distance. But then he came to Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban came to Eretz Yisrael, and he saw with his own eyes that the traditional site of Rachel's burial was very close to Bethlehem. And so he changed his mind. And he said that the traditional site was the correct site, and that the idea of Rachel crying for her children was allegorical. And it was as they were trudging through their ancestral portions. Remember our favorite map, their ancestral portions. They are going from Jerusalem. They're going up through Binyamin to Ramah, which is in the north part of Binyamin. And then they're going to go through Ephraim. They're going to go through Manasseh. They're going to go through Manasseh to the east. And they're going to keep on going until they get to Bavel. So it's allegorical, says the Ramban, that when we see Rachel weeping for her children, it's not that they are passing by her tomb. It's that she, from on high, from in heaven, is seeing her children, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Binyamin, going through their ancestral lands and having to leave. So that's why she's crying for her children. And that's why God says to them, don't worry, Rachel, they will come back. V'shavu vanim ligvulam. They will come back to their borders. Look at there, I put it in yellow for you. V'shavu vanam ligvulam. And the children, whose children? Rachel's children, Binyamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh, will return to their own border. And that, says the Ramban, is what the explanation is. Not that Kever Rachel was in Ramah, but the voice was heard in Ramah on high because her children were leaving their ancestral homes and she was crying for her children. And look at this pasuk. I just want to end with this. We've gone a couple of minutes over, but we didn't start until about 25 past because of the intro. Look at this last pasuk, which is very famous to you from the Haftarah of the second day of Rosh Hashanah. V'yesh tikva la'achritech. There is hope for your future. Ni'um Hashem, so says Hashem. V'shavu vanim ligvulam. The children will return to their borders. What did we do when we returned to the borders? We made a national anthem called Ha-Tikvah. Look at this pasuk. Is it not interesting that when speaking about the Bnei Yisrael returning to their land, the verse uses the expression Tikvah. And I ask you the question, have you heard that somewhere before? Ha-Tikvah brings us back to the border. So I'd like to suggest to you that Kever Rachel really is somewhere around here, pretty much around there. And we can square all the psukim in Tanakh with my theory that Binyamin's border moved a little bit at the time of Shmuel, and there it is moving. There's the border moving, and that the Kol Barama Nishma is referring allegorically to the voice of Rachel in heaven crying for her children as they go through their land. So I will end there. Those of you who wish to leave, please feel free to do so. Those of you who wish to stay and ask questions or give comments, I will stay as long as anybody wants to stay. You're all muted at the moment. I suggest that the way to do this is probably for you to lift up your hand icon, and then I can see who wants it rather than all shouting out at once. Otherwise, we'll have a bit of a balagan. So I'll open it up to everybody. Those of you who are leaving, thank you for joining us, and thank you all for your wishes for myself and for Neville and Deborah and for Michael and Anita for our York sites. And once again, I wish you ga'aguim mutukim. I wish you all sweet memories. So I will leave it there. Any questions? Any comments? Nobody. Not even Vivian Simonoff. Oh, yes.
Yeah, go on.
Thought I could rely on you. Come on, get the ball rolling. Get the ball rolling, Vivian.
First of all, that was fascinating. I'm always really interested in this concept of us being so attached to tombs, based on the fact that I was always told that we never know where Moshe Rabbeinu is buried. And I was always told that there was a very good reason for that Hashem did not ever want us to get mixed up between the remains of someone who'd done his holy work with himself. And therefore I find it a bit odd that there is an entire sort of industry that has grown up around, what's the plural of kaverim?
Varim.
Yeah.
Yeah,
how do you feel about it?
Okay, it's something which I have actually very strong feelings about. Kever hopping, as I call it, it does not do it for me at all.
Right.
It doesn't. There is a very fine line between going to the burial place of a holy person and feeling inspired by the actions of that person and, if you like, asking for assistance from the atmosphere of that place to elevate yourself to be able to pray to God in a higher level. That's one side of the fine line. The other side of the fine line is to go to the grave of a holy person and to pray to that holy person to intervene on your behalf. Now, personally, I don't think that's right. You want to pray to God yourself. God wants to hear from you. If you've got something to say it yourself. Sure, and you understand that where this fine line is. And you know, the same person can be on one side of the line on the same day. But I agree with you, there is a whole industry of kever hopping. It never does it for me, I'll be honest. The only place where I have been inspired in that way was at Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. And I think for me personally, that goes back to my childhood, because I remember, I don't know if Liz is still with us, but she will also remember because she's older than me, obviously. I remember when I was aged 8 in 1968, my parents took us we came to Israel. It wasn't the first time I'd been, but it was the first time I remembered coming. And it was shortly after the 6-Day War, and we could go to Ma'arat HaMachpelah. I was 8 years old. Those of you who come from Manchester will know that the school I went to, Jewish day school, even then, even though it's a different type of school than it is today, gave a first-class Jewish education. And certainly, I knew at age 8, I knew my Chumash inside out. I knew all about Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I knew where they were buried. And it really blew my mind, aged 8, to be stood at Ma'arat HaMachpelah. It did not do that for me at the Kotel HaMaravi, but it did at Ma'arat HaMachpelah. And to this day, that is a place where I do feel inspired. But for me, I think that inspiration is more about me remembering my childhood and the fond memories that I have of that trip and my parents taking me to this amazing place than it does with the kever hopping. But there are people who go around Europe, and there are trips that you can pay to go on where somebody will take you from kever to kever to kever. You can go to the Rebbe Eli Melech, you can go to the Chofetz Chaim, you can go to all sorts of places. I've got a picture of my oldest son when he went on the Jewish grammar kever hopping trip to Eastern Europe. I've got a picture of him at the kever of the Chofetz Chaim, and you can see on his face, He is utterly broken at this place. It's, you know, there must have been something, a speech or something, whatever it was going on. He was inspired by that place. Now that's fine. But if you cross the line, if a person crosses the line and is davening to the dead person, I hesitate to jump in and say something that might upset somebody. But, you know, Uman, for example, Reb Nachman, I've got a problem with that. A real problem with that. So I agree with you, Vivian. I think there is a difficulty with that. Keva Rachel, because of this idea of Rachel weeping for her children, I think is in a different category. Because I think the concept of Rachel weeping for her children does inspire people. It inspires this whole story, this whole idea, this imagination of Rachel on high, weeping as her children go into exile. We perhaps can't envisage that so much because we're so fortunate to not be living in exile. We're living in the land of Israel. But imagine over the centuries and over the millennia of the people who've had tough lives in wherever exile they've been, imagining Rachel weeping over those exile. It's a very powerful imagery. And I think that, you know, do you know what did it for me the most in Keva Rachel? I'll tell you. I know it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I want to tell you this. You probably saw in the video of Shweki that I played to you, there's a little bit of it which shows the keva, one of the tomb things, covered in a white parochet. Don't know if you remember that. Yes. That white parochet is the wedding dress of the girl. I can't remember her first name. Applebaum.
Naomi
Applebaum. You should know that name. Yeah, Applebaum. Yes. Who was murdered by a terrorist on her wedding day, and that was the wedding dress was on there. Now, when I saw that, that was what did it for me. You know, absolutely. So it depends. Everybody has got their own thing that pushes their button. But the point that you make about keva hopping, I think, is a very important point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? No one else. Okay, in that case, I shall bid you all a good night. I don't know if you're still recording